Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. We will be sharing our perspectives and your own. Your host, Erin Pizzey, was born in 1939 in China while her father was stationed there as a member of the British Foreign Office. In 1971, Erin opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men suffering. Nevertheless, it's a passion she continues to hold to this day for men, for women, and especially for children.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior experienced in childhood is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue and never was. It's a generational issue. To my amazement, nobody ever wanted to hear why violent people treat each other the way they do. Instead, feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships, but for many years men and boys have been held to ransom and have been made to live in the knowledge that they are dispensable and shamed. There is an enormous job ahead of us, but my hope is that the 21st century will see men and women standing shoulder to shoulder and working together to actively take on the feminists and to show everyone that domestic violence is not and never has been a gender issue.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalised, disadvantaged and ignored. We will be inviting you to call in and discuss your views and your experiences. Anyone of any age, sex, sexual orientation or religious background is invited to call in and talk. We may not get to everyone, but we will do our best within the show's allotted time. If you do wish to call in to share your own experiences, you will probably want to keep things on a first-name basis. You may wish to use a pseudonym for yourself or family members so that there's no concern about privacy. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. The truth is often painful to hear, but in truth, there is hope, and we hope you will stick around to hear it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the 21st of December 2013 episode of Revelations with Erin Pizzey. My name is Dean Esme, Erin's co-host. I believe this will be our last show of 2013, Erin.
Yes, it will. And let's hope we go into the new year with lots and lots of energy.
I think we will. Lots of energy and lots of good things happening. I'm a little tired this morning, just because I had to get up early on a Saturday morning. We just did a Google Hangout with Glenn Poole in the UK. Yes. And a Greg Anderson of Australia's 1 in 3 campaign. And it was a great talk. Go to Paul Elam's YouTube channel. You'll see it there. It's also now on the front page of A Voice for Men. We're enjoying doing those hangouts, and we might start dragging you into them at some point, Erin.
Okay.
We also do a regular Monday roundup hang-up with Dr. T, Dr. Tara Palmatier, Dr. T as we call her. You check out one of those hangouts, Erin?
Yes, I'd love to.
No, I mean, have you had a chance to watch one?
Yes, I did. I watched one yesterday with Paul,
and Dr. T talking to each other. We'll have a lot to say today, I think.
She's a horrible woman, isn't she? I'm not sure we want her on the show. But maybe we should bring her on to say hello. Dr. T, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good morning, Dean. Good morning, Erin.
Hey. So anyway, let's just jump right into things. 2013 has been a banner year, and lots of exciting things have happened. These are actually two women I've been wanting to get into the same room for quite some time. So now I'm a very lucky man. I have a Erin Pizzey, Dr. T sandwich going on. It's pretty cool. Why don't we just jump right into things? Dr. T is best known for her business and website, shrinkformen.com. Now, I understand some of our audience will already know this, but let's pretend we don't. How'd you get into doing shrinkformen.com, Dr. T?
Well, I had worked in not-for-profit clinical organizations and private practice, and I noticed that more and more men were coming in talking, they were having depression, anxiety, and stemming from their relationship issues, which isn't so uncommon. But in exploring what was going on, a lot of these men were suffering oftentimes emotional abuse and some of them even physical abuse, but they didn't recognize it as such because, of course, in our culture right now, we don't acknowledge that men can be victims of partner violence, are just as likely to be victims of partner violence as women are. And in talking with friends, I had a couple of friends who happened to be going through a very difficult divorce at approximately the same time with women who were certainly...
Hang on a minute. I apologize. We've got a dog problem here.
I have dogs of my own, so I understand.
Live radio, anything can happen. Okay, we're good now? Okay.
Yeah.
Go. I'm sorry. Continue, Dr. T.
And so the friends encouraged me. They said, you should be blogging about this. I wish I'd had this information 10, 20 years ago. So on a lark, really, I registered for a free WordPress blog and started publishing. And for about the first 6 months, my traffic doubled every month. I was really quite surprised. And here we are.
You said something interesting there that fascinates me. I've seen this myself. Not that I do clinical work, but I've seen it myself. Men not even recognizing that they're being abused. Why is that, do you think? Literally, I've run across men who've had knives pulled on them and things like heavy objects thrown in their faces, and when I say, that's abusive behavior, it's like I've just said, you realize that you're a Martian, right? Do you know what I'm talking about there?
I do, or they're very quick to, well, he must have done something to her. Did he cheat on her? As if he's somehow deserving of the abuse, which is amazing, right? Because feminists are the first ones to go all nuclear if you do anything that even hints at victim blaming. But that's exactly what we do to many male victims of domestic violence is, well, he must have done something to provoke her. It's like what? Not passing the salt quickly enough? That's the thing. When you're living with an abusive personality, you don't necessarily need to do anything if they're looking to emotionally discharge.
I think there's a lot of denial as well. I mean, an awful lot of men that I've worked with, it takes quite a long time to get them to even admit that they're in this weak position with this very terrifying woman that they're living with. Mostly, quite a lot of abusive behavior. Men will just write off as, oh, she has a tantrum. Oh, it's her time of the month. Oh, it's excuse after excuse. Because for many men,
she's had a difficult childhood.
Yes. Shame. So I was working with women. Half the trouble was actually making them take responsibility for what was happening, and the other half is trying to work with men and making them realize that they're not necessarily responsible for all the violence in the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now all violence doesn't have to be physical, does it?
Oh, no. Gosh, no. I mean, it's a whole gamut of relationships, and sometimes it's much harder to detect the mental torture that couples can put each other through, because it can be so subtle. Whereas at least if you have a bruise, you know something's happened. What do you think, Dr. T?
I think, although I think physical violence is awful, but it's much easier for a man to recognize that, being hit over the head repeatedly with the television remote control, or being kicked or scratched or bitten, physical violence is easier to recognize that this is violence. The emotional violence seems to be, in my experience anyway, much more difficult for at least the men I've worked with to recognize as such.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, we seem to be having a little bit of connectivity issues this morning. Erin's dropped on us. I'm going to try to get her back on the line. In the meantime, Go ahead.
Oh, no, well, I mean, I think part of the issue, too, for many of the men who end up in these relationships as adults is that oftentimes they grew up in a family system that had one or both parents who were abusive in similar ways. And for many of these men, as Erin mentioned just a few moments ago, is that this is normal female behavior.
I can see that. In fact, I believe it. How do you... Well, I don't know. I suppose in your case, Dr. T, it's probably not too big a problem you face. If a man comes to you, he already knows he has a problem, right?
Typically, yes. By the time he gets to Shrink for Men, he's already, he's because I don't advertise. It's all of the traffic, I believe, is through search, or somebody shares a link in a forum they belong to, or on another website, or a friend has been doing research for a loved one whom they're worried about, and sometimes people have found me because their couples therapists I know of two occasions where a couples therapist quietly slipped the URL address of my website on an appointment card to the husband or boyfriend who is in couples counseling.
Really? Wow. Well, that's actually pretty cool. That indicates to me some sort of dawning awareness is going on out there. Erin, do we have you back? I can't tell.
Yes, you do. I'm sorry about it. It keeps dropping, doesn't it?
That's all right. It's once again, that's the perils of live radio.
I'm just relieved for once it's not my equipment that's having problems. It's usually me.
Yeah. I don't know what you think, Dr. T, but I think now it is becoming much more generally accepted that the figures for domestic violence are about equal. I'm in LA at the moment. Normally I live in London. But just moving around and talking to ordinary, everyday people, there's a kind of, oh, yeah, of course. And you and I both know that, say, 30 years ago, it would have been a stunned silence if you dared to say that women could be equally violent. In fact, I mean, I've turned from so many dinner tables because I would not back down on that. Now, people are taking it for granted. Do you find that?
It's interesting. What I've noticed just since I started Shrink for Men back in, it was, I think, January of 2009, so it'll be, oh my gosh, I've been doing that Shrink for Men for 5 years now? Whoa. Time flies. But what I've noticed just over the last 4 or 5 years is I when there's a news item, say, about a woman who's been arrested for domestic violence or for trying to kill her husband or having murdered her husband or her children as part of a custody dispute, I always read the comments. And I've noticed that the comments are changing. 5 years ago, it was very, well, he must have done something to deserve it. Oh, she must have been an abuse victim. And now people are saying that's wrong. She needs to go to jail. That's domestic violence. So just even in the comment section for sites that don't ban those types of comments, many of them do, such as the Huffington Post, for example. But I noticed that's changed. I've noticed in my personal relationships or social conversations, there's still some pushback to that, but it's not as bad as it used to be.
It may vary by region too. It almost certainly does. I do recall one of the videos somewhere on YouTube. Some guy just going off on me, saying I was completely insane to say that women were anywhere near as abusive as men, and it's like you can't penetrate with some people. But I'd like to think that you're right and that it's changing. I think law enforcement needs help understanding more than anything, though.
But don't you think that's our problem, Dean? Because the average person on the street intelligently recognizes, on the whole, that it can be both people. Our problem is essentially the saturated agencies and the establishment figures, as you say, the police, the judiciary, that for years and years, all the training was by feminists. So everything they've been told is completely one-sided. And all their policies, their written policies, basically exclude men from any kind of consideration. So that's where the real job is. Because you, apart from anything else, you've got, as Dr. T and I both know, and you do, huge vested interests in this. And it's money. So when you start,
I think divorce is a $50 billion a year. It's a $50 billion a year industry, and that's just in the United States.
Yeah, and then you've got the domestic violence industry that feeds off the divorce industry, and that's even richer. So not only that, you've got a whole tranche of very powerful international women who have grown into these positions of power that are going to hang on to that funding and that money. And, of course, they've actually, in a sense, created jobs only for girls, if you like, haven't they? No men can work in refuges. And in all of these subjects that are sort of women-only subjects, which domestic violence is, but now that there are more lawyers, women lawyers, than there are male lawyers, more women doctors than there are male, and right the way through, actually, all the caring system, you've got a very highly stacked organization against anyone actually telling the truth. So where do we go from there? In a sense, it's not just the old-fashioned on-the-street battle with the feminist movement who've hijacked the whole subject all this time. It's now, the strategy has to be to get to the people at the top and actually say, hey, you're wrong.
Well, I think some of those people are going to have to be removed because they're just so indoctrinated and entrenched in that ideology, and that will be tough. It becomes a self-feeding system, a self-contained self-feeding system where they only bring in people who they seem to only bring in people who toe the party line. I worked in various not-for-profit organizations when I was in graduate school and shortly after graduating, and I can remember sitting in on the budget meetings, and in order to continue to get funded at the same rate for many state and federal funding sources, you have to demonstrate that, one, that the population you're serving is growing, not decreasing, and two, you have to spend more money than you're given to continue to receive money at the same rate. I believe this is how it worked. I haven't worked in a not-profit for about a decade now, so things may have changed, but in essence, and here's the thing about feminism and the domestic violence industry. It's like for all of the millions of dollars and decades that they've been at it, they keep claiming that things are getting far, far worse, which of course doesn't match the research that people like Murray Strauss have done that show that actually domestic violence against women has been steadily decreasing since the 1970s, while violence, intimate partner violence against men, has been on the rise since the 1970s. But if they have to keep creating this fear, it's a war on women. A woman is battered every 0.2 seconds, because otherwise they can't keep filling their coffers, which are quite deep. I think a lot of this is self-perpetuated because there's real money there.
Well, and particularly with VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, which they're now trying to drive internationally. And
right now.
I've just been hearing from Ed Bartlett's outfit, SAVE. They've been up in Washington. And what is very good news is that the people they're talking to in your higher echelons are beginning to listen and actually beginning to agree. Because, I mean, I know in England, and I imagine it's the same here, that no men can work in the shelters. No men can sit on the board. No men can be involved. It's a woman-only subject at the moment, and this is why. And there's no research on what they're doing. There's no figures. It's all completely secret. And it's dangerous, because what's happening now is really the decimation of men and boys and the family.
Dr. T, you've spoken in the past about something you called the estrogen ghetto.
Yeah, you're right.
I don't know if that's a phrase you still use, but I believe the context you meant was the growing female dominance of the so-called helping professions, psychology, social work, even medicine. One of the interesting things is we had Professor Don Dutton on here, who's a hell of a guy and a very noted. He's a psychologist, obviously, and a professor. And he did, in fact, agree that a majority of his students were female at this point. Although he didn't seem to think it was quite as bad as all that. And he's about 70 now, and he's telling me that the young women he's seeing now actually seem to be more open-minded rather than less. I mean, they're shocked when he tells them this is what the figures actually show on domestic violence. But what he also said was he's seeing a lot of these young women being open-minded to this information rather than angered and in denial about it. So I don't know if I have a question about that so much as an observation. Maybe things are changing.
That would be great. It wasn't. I was in the last time I was in a classroom was in 1999, 2000. So perhaps things have changed over the last 15 years. That would be great. But certainly when I was doing my master's and doctoral training in the mid 90s to early 2000, you couldn't have said that in any one of my classes.
One of the things I found the most damaging was looking at the books that were being used to train social workers, particularly in child protection and domestic violence. And actually, essentially, most of those books will have to be taken off the shelves because the figures they give and the conclusions they come to, which is the old idea that, of course, no woman is guilty of any kind of violence, and if she is violent, it is because it's in self-defense. And that is actually what these students were being taught, and then they were let loose. And so as far as they were concerned, if there was any kind of domestic violence, it is the man, whatever the situation is, who is at fault. And they were brainwashed from a very early age. Yeah,
that's
I know.
What I was taught, and it wasn't until I started doing my direct clinical work that what I was hearing in my office was not matching up with what I was taught in my books, and I changed my belief pretty quickly.
This is anecdotal, so I'm just offering it to you because I need your advice. One of the things I've noticed, and now I'm at 74, and a lot of my children who are in the refuges, I know where they are and what they're doing and what's happened to them. I found, which doesn't terribly surprise me, that the girls were far more successful in recovering from the domestic violence and creating their lives than the boys were. Many more of my boys have continued from the violence to become violent themselves, and many of them have ended up in prisons. And I've always said I find girls incredibly much more resilient to the damage done in the family than the boys. And I don't know why that is. That's just an observation. What would you say?
That's interesting. I haven't followed any children of these situations longitudinally, so I can't speak to that. But I wonder if that's because there's so much more of a support system for girls and young women and adult women.
And they support each other, don't they?
And they support each other, and they have less shame than boys who have been abused. I mean, it's very hard, I think, for most men to come out and say I've been abused or I was sexually abused. Even is a big taboo for many of them to say that.
Well, I've always found you see. Yeah, go on,
no, go ahead.
You go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no!
All right, I'll go ahead.
Okay.
All right, I'll go ahead.
Somebody talk.
That's right. I don't know how much of it's social, and I don't know how much of it goes deeper. One of the things I've noted is that it is almost a shattering realization for a man to say, my God, my mother abused me. There's something about mommy, whatever. We just need to see her as an angel, and we just kind of need to believe that whatever happened, it must have been our fault or somebody's help, because it can't have been glorious soft mommy, right? I mean, I'm being only a little sarcastic, but I actually wonder.
Cult of motherhood in our society. It's that's, and I jokingly refer to it, it's the golden uterus.
There's that, and I think young boys feel a protective impulse toward their moms. It's just rough, I've actually seen it. Oh my God, my mother really did abuse me, and I don't mean in a repressed memory suddenly remembered, but just like, oh, you mean when she said those horrible, vicious, awful things to me, that was actually not true at all and horribly abusive? I didn't have that coming. Oh my God! The truth is, I came out of it.
Or mom made you her little surrogate partner after she drove dad out of. I don't mean you specifically, Dean, but there's parentification, which is happens a lot with the children of an abusive mother or father. The child is made to take care of the emotional and sometimes physical needs of the parent, and that's horribly damaging and can set them up for a life of codependency. And being a codependent makes you vulnerable to getting into an abusive relationship.
That's true, yeah.
I think Erin, your word for it is emotional incest.
Yeah, and it's interesting because for men it's so much more obvious because there's a lot of actual touching and molesting, whereas for women with their sons it can be emotionally incestuous to such an extent that it doesn't actually even have to be physical. It is an erotic relationships between a mother and son. For instance, I remember a boy explaining to me he was about 7 years old and still bathing with his mother. And it hadn't struck him then until he was much older that it was completely inappropriate. And I think that a lot. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that co-sleeping too is an issue. I have clients who have been trying to talk to children's therapists, to CPS, saying, my wife is still co-sleeping. It's not even co-sleeping anymore with my 10-year-old son, with my 12-year-old son, with my 11-year-old daughter, and very rarely will action be taken by the courts for that.
No, because they don't really recognize emotional damage. It's certainly it's written into the description of domestic violence, but in a sense, it's going to take. I don't think that we can make a huge change to the whole concept of dysfunctional violence and sexually abusive families until we take it out of the court system, because the court system distorts what's happening, because it is not designed to deal with something that's complicated and as infinitely difficult as human relationships. So I think we need to actually take it out into the sphere of mental health and deal with it there with people who are trained to understand what's going on. And then at the end of it all, if you have to rubber stamp a divorce or a custody issue, that's how you do it. Because this is what we did in the refuge. Mm-hmm. We actually negotiated and mediated everywhere possible before we went anywhere near the courts.
That would be great, but on the other hand, I know, and this is secondhand and anecdotal, of course, but from folks who participate on my website and forum, and from my practice, they've talked to children's therapists. They've gone to multiple therapists, couples counseling therapists, and then after the divorce, and well, that's just a difference in parenting style. And they don't intervene, and there's an incredible amount of mother bias, particularly in the mental health field, and just bias against women, where therapists, not all of them, but I think a good percentage of them they're very quick to excuse any kind of abuse or impropriety by the woman. And then the man is instructed, you need to be patient or understanding or drop this. I mean, I had one of the men who wrote during the Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October, in his own word series, he was the gentleman who married 2 young children, and his wife got involved with some other guy and was taping the 2 of them having sex and then sharing the videos with this man she was having an affair with. It was some bizarre thing going on. Anyway, he went to multiple therapists. He felt he has trauma from this. He was horribly betrayed. He didn't get those. This other man still has these videos. He doesn't know what he's doing with them. But the therapist that he went to with his wife said, "Well, your wife was a victim too." It's like,
yeah.
Wait a minute.
No. My point would have been that half the trouble I have, rather like you, is that because all of the services have been feminized and all the training has been against men, it's going to take an enormous, I don't know how you're going to do it, but shelves and shelves of books we're going to have to be got rid of, because most of it is actually wrong. And it's before anything can happen, it has to be a general consensus that over the last 40 years, there's been an enormous lie out there because the whole thing is hijacked. And this is the problem, because where do we start? It's political now, because essentially we have to change all the services, from the police to the judiciary to everybody who deals with domestic violence, to understand that it's always been a generational issue. It's never been a gender issue. That's the lie, isn't it?
That's one of the big lies, absolutely.
And therefore we can't really have much chance of changing or helping people except in our own individual ways until all this is changed. And I don't quite know. I don't think anybody knows. It's like this mountainous event that's happened over time where everybody's pretended it's not happening. Well, okay, how do we open it up so it becomes some kind of discussion which is going to make the changes? How are we going to say to Hillary Clinton, Hillary, you're one of these women in positions of power and partly responsible for this enormous great lie. What are you going to do about changing it?
One of the things, and it is interesting, you were talking earlier about, co-sleeping until someone's 10, 11, 12 years old with a mother, and I remember one of the things I immediately flashed on, it's like, well, it's because she doesn't have a penis, so there can't be anything dangerous there, right? There is this demonization of male sexuality, too. Of course, all pedophiles are men, right? I suppose so. If you... well, if you will only define sexual abuse in a certain way, I guess so. But I mean,
they've really rigged. It's a rigged system.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna. This is also anecdotal, but some years ago, I actually dated a licensed, trained social worker who worked for Child Protective Services. Now, I have some sympathy for Child Protective Services because they, in that profession, they're somewhat in a double mind. if they don't act under certain circumstances, they're beat up for having not acted, and then if they do act and they make a mistake, they're also beat up on, but it comes with the territory. But I just remember this woman I dated, very nice woman, like I said, fully qualified social worker, went and saw child abuse cases every day, and I had a couple conversations with her. I remember one, I said, because I've known about this stuff for years, right? You know that most a lot of women can be violent toward their men. And she laughed, literally, and then she kind of stopped herself and said, well, yeah, that is true. And I said, well, and, I'm not one to get in people's faces, plus we were dating, so it would be rude. I said, and you realize most child abuse is committed by women, right? And she just stopped and looked. I said, no, really, isn't that what you see? And she's like, no, I had never thought about it, but yeah, that's actually true on what I see. And it's just like, she'd been doing it for 10 years, and it's like me, no background in the subject, admitted I was right on both counts, yet some sort of cognitive something didn't click with her until I said it, and I don't know if she thought about it again ever after that conversation. So it just sort of like, yeah, it amazes me that I am listening to Erin Pizzey, who on her own more or less started the international dialogue on this, and decades later I'm talking to Dr. Tara Palmatier, who has had to discover on her own what Erin's known for 40 years. I don't know. It just seems grossly ironic to me.
I think a lot of it, is looking at how women operate, because one of I think the ferocious thing about us as women is that people have to agree. I mean, it's like I call being drummed out of the brownies, because if you don't do the thing that everybody else is doing, whether it's wearing very, very expensive shoes and handbags that everybody has to have, and women behave like lemmings, and so they are ferocious if you cross women. I mean, as you know, those of us in the early days began to do the battling and standing up and saying, no, this isn't true. Well, we were seriously threatened. And one of the things that I think there's a huge amount of fear among women, because the moment, and I know Dr. T's been through it, because any of us who tell the truth, the moment we do, and we're surrounded by feminists or radical feminists, the atmosphere goes absolutely icy. And I actually gave up going out to dinner with any groups of people because I knew I'd be attacked. And I just couldn't be bothered to spend my time trying to defend myself because I got exhausted out of it all. And I mean, there's the pickets, and then there's all the threatening that goes on with it. And but privately, so often a woman will come up and she'll say, yeah, it was my mother. It was my mother that abused me. But publicly, it's still a taboo subject. Women are still, and men are the worst offenders. How many fathers say to children who are abused by their mothers, what did you do to upset Mum? Many, particularly fathers of alcoholic women, where the child knows something seriously wrong that's going on, and then the father will look at the child and simply say, that's not like your mother. What did you do to make her do that?
Well, your mother does love you. Well,
yeah,
right.
That's right.
So now you're telling your kid that mom abusing you is a form of love.
Yeah.
Oh, man, that's rough. Hey, listen, we have a caller on the line who's been waiting patiently for some time now. Okay. Scribbler G, are you on the air? Hello?
I'm right here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can. I think I remember you from the hangout this morning.
Yeah, and hi, I wanted to say hi, Dean. That was really great this morning. Even though we disagreed, I think we did so in a very productive way. So I have a different angle on this, and I want to share two things. One, what it's like to be a victim of abuse and how women look at you if you actually tell them about that. And then two, my abusive ex-wife. First was I was horribly abused as a child by what would qualify that as the thing that women talk fantasize about in their ramblings. I had a terroristic dad who was super violent, and as a result later in life, and by the way, my mom passed away early, and So it's just a lot of, lack of protection, right? So later in life, I had a life-threatening incident happen. I was plunged into very severe PTSD. And it's one of the silver linings of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars is that they've learned a lot about PTSD. And one of the things, they're trying to figure out, well, why do some people get it and why do some people not? Well, it turns out if you've had childhood PTSD events, the likelihood to get chronic and severe PTSD as an adult is much, much higher. And I actually had a rock climbing fall that was life-threatening, and I began to, within months of that, get vertigo and pass out. I was hospitalized, and I encountered a level of anxiety that's still present in my life, which I have tools to manage, but it's just, crippling would be a little bit too strong of a word, but very, very profound. A very profound effect on my life, right? And I've had a lot of therapy. I've gotten a lot of help. So my point is different in the sense that what was the most stunning thing to me was I come from a big family, and I'd been a father figure to two of my sisters because my dad was obviously not one, particularly one of my sisters. And then my daughter, who's now 25, have essentially, since this all happened, have basically turned on me. Have had no compassion for me. Dismissed me as like have actually used like the mental illness thing to gaslight me, and it was just and these are people, these are easily the three people I spent the most effort in my life loving, supporting materially, and really it's one of the things that drove me to the men's rights movement, what I wanted to say about that is that I think that men, there's a shame that goes along with being abused. And I had recurring nightmares from the age of 7 on. I had, chronic anxiety conditions from the age of 7 on. I mean, I was, I don't have like one of these hazy diagnoses, like when they finally figured out PTSD, a shrink hadn't seen in 3 years calling back. He's like, that's what you've got, because now we know what it is. And the lack of empathy and compassion for men who are victims of abuse is astonishing to me. My male friends, only 2 of them really have any listening for it at all. My brothers have no listening for it whatsoever, and it's just kind of amazing. And I'm not sure. What do you make of that? And then I'll also like to tell you about my abusive wife in a moment, but I'd love to get some feedback on all that.
Sure, I can jump in, and if neither Erin or Dean have, unless Erin or Dean would like to go
ahead, Dr. T. You go ahead.
Well, I'll make a quick observation, which is something that happens to me a lot, which is I had not heard that study had established that people who had experienced childhood trauma were more likely to suffer from PTSD. But why does it not surprise me that that is so? It shouldn't. Yet somehow I was like shocked. But anyway, yeah, Dr. T, what do you think?
Well, I think for the men who had a hard time listening to you, I wonder, or I suspect perhaps it has to do with their own ability to think about if they've suffered abuse. What I've noticed is that for women, identifying as a victim is a very easy thing. I mean, women identify as being a victim because, they didn't get the parking space they wanted. It's just, a lot, not all, but I think many women, they don't have an issue saying, yes, I've been victimized, I've been harmed, I need help. A lot of men do, and it's not just even about asking the help, it's acknowledging that they have been harmed, that they have been abused. I can understand that on a personal level, because I was never, I have been harmed in my life. I have been harassed. I've been bullied, but it's still hard to say, yes, I was a victim of bullying. I was a victim of this, and it's just because I don't want to feel weak. I don't want to be perceived as weak. And I wonder, and I don't know for certain, but I've often wondered if that's one of the self-imposed obstacles that men who have suffered horrible things have a difficult time getting, surmounting in order to get help. Thinking out loud there.
I processed it in a slightly different way, and as I became exposed to the men's rights movement, and as I really got present to the fact that my value in my family system and much of society is as protector and provider. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I played that role. I played type A hard for a lot of my life. Mm-hmm. And the way I processed with my daughter and my sisters is that, and I played that role in their lives, right? That they didn't value me anymore. You see, my value. What's stunning to me is
being strong and a protector and a provider.
And I actually thought they always loved me as a human being. And when that utility went away, I've also it's hurt my career. I have a lot of issues in my life as a result of this, right? And I was a very high stress kind of work, and it's really hard for me to do that kind of high pressure work with a serious anxiety condition, right? Mm-hmm. And so I make a lot less money, and I don't look as good as I once did. It's really taken a toll on me. And I had this sense of, I was so glad that I built these. I mean, this happened to me when I was in my early 40s, right? So I had long had these strong relationships with these people, and I just kind of thought that, wow, I could kind of rely on them. Like I could fall back on their love, on their, you know what I'm saying? They could, nothing. It's just amazing to me. And I think that it's a much crueler thing than you're laying out. I think that it's the way men are objectified by women. Mm-hmm. And not by all women. I want to be careful. I think we're all human and capable of a full range of human emotions, but I think many women view men as in a purely utilitarian ways. And if you're not filling that utilitarian role anymore, forget about dating.
Sometimes, can I just say something at this point?
Please.
Sometimes, what can happen is that those three women put you in the good daddy role, and when you were being the provider, the protector, this includes your wife, you were the good daddy. Now, when you stopped being daddy, they didn't know what to do with you because they'd never seen you as a real person. So I know it's cruel and it's painful for you, but in a way, they have to re-educate themselves to see you as a lovable, ordinary, everyday human male, not as this great big type A successful daddy figure. Certainly your two sisters would have seen you as a daddy figure, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And what they often feel, and they'll explain it to me, is that you have let them down. Mm-hmm. They aren't capable of seeing that, in fact, both sides had completely different perceptions, and now in order to come together, huge changes have to be made.
I think I've seen this particularly in younger men, and at this point, younger even means under 50 probably, but I do think certain culture, I've seen a number of younger men who simply just accepted that women are incapable of literally incapable of loving men as anything other than utilities, and as soon as a man is useless to them, they no longer give a damn about them. I've actually seen guys who've come to the point where they believe this is just female nature, like it comes with having two X chromosomes. And I'm very resistant to that idea, but I think cultural forces have done a lot to exacerbate that. I think fathers used to be much more respected.
Absolutely.
And it was not an unusual thing. For example, Dad's gotten old. He's going to come live with us because it's our job to take care of him now. Dad's sick. It's our job to take care of him. And that seems to have gone out the window in recent decades. I think maybe men have always been viewed as utilities, but I'm convinced it was never quite as bad as now.
Well, but even that
I think you have to remember. Sorry, Dr. T. Would you like to go ahead, and I'll come in next?
I just wanted to add to Dean, but that can also be a difficult time when the father is older. I've known in my own family and in other families I'm close to. For instance, my grandfather, when he needed help, he couldn't. His health was failing, and he had a hard time letting his son or his daughter help him in the bathroom, help him get dressed, because he'd always been the one who took care of everybody. I think it was harder on him, and it was also hard for my aunts and uncles who were doing most of the caring work, because they were happy and glad to do it. They didn't feel put out or discussed like it, or just didn't know what to do with it, like Scribbler, your family did. But it was the roles had changed, and it was it was difficult for everyone, I think, but more so for my grandfather. And I've seen that happen in other families where it's either, just through age and the body is giving out, or there's Alzheimer's or some type of dementia. So that's all I was going to add.
Well, so there's a little thing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please.
I just want to take you back to, as I've said, from my generation, when in fact most women were at home and working. I mean, the idea that you don't work in the family is ludicrous, because you work harder as a woman at home with a family than you actually do in the office. So and so she'd be home, the children would be home, and the point of the day was that Daddy was coming home, and when he did come home, he would expect, and the wife, that's part of the deal that you make when you got married in those days, is that you'd be ready to have supper ready, and the children would sit round the table, and he would sit at the head of the table, because his role as father provider was a very, very deeply entrenched role. And then suddenly, in the 70s, you're all too young to remember, but suddenly the idea of a man in the family, it was a dangerous place for a family to be with a man. The new idea was there would only be women and children that would be the new model for the family, and the men were going to be dispensable because they couldn't be trusted, because they were potential rapists and batterers and abusers of women. And that has been going for so long now that there's a couple of generations of young women that have grown up that, you're quite right, see men purely as a mechanical accessory to what they need to make this new life for themselves successful. And so I think there's been a sea change in an attitude to men and to boys. And until that's changed, I think there's going to be a tremendous disharmony between women and between men, and between the whole concept of children and what children need. My belief is that men are absolutely indispensable to the lives of women and children, as women are indispensable to the lives of men and children. Right, it's a stunned silence. Has anybody got anything?
I'm not going to disagree with you.
Look, it's a brilliant insight. I did want to throw out one other angle on this, just might spawn some more interesting conversation. So my short-lived marriage, which by the way was a traditional marriage that I got married in '86. I'm 51. And I actually tried to do that stay-at-home thing in the modern world, and it was, you took supper ready, greet me happily. How about not looking at me like you hate me when I walk through the door after a 14-hour day, when you've been home living off of me. But that's we could go off all day on that. But so my ex-wife used to hit me, but I grew up around a lot of violence. Also grew up in a violent neighborhood. I had a lot of fights when I was younger. I swore off violence as a 17-year-old, but hitting me doesn't really freak me out. Right? Like, I don't. Now, what freaks me out is if somebody's got power over me, or if I think they can kill me and they start hitting me. So when I started hearing this talk of like female abuse, and I'd be like, yeah, my ex-wife hit me, but she would hit me hard enough to hurt me just once when she was pissed off about something, or she wanted to like correct me about something, And it took me a long time, really, to only recently say that was abuse. And it was not like love taps; it was hard enough to hurt. But for me, just consider the context, right? So I've got all the, you want to see abuse? I'll show you abuse. I couldn't even take it seriously as thinking of it as abuse. But if you look at the emotional abuse she entered into, which was very difficult, which took the form of withdrawing affection, which took the form of interfering with my role as a father, which took the form of openly criticizing me in social settings, to the point like where her sister stopped inviting us to her house and confronted her and said, the way you treat your husband is embarrassing to me and you should be ashamed of yourself. Like, a lot of external validation of what was going on, right? So, you can always get too subjective about these things. And it was like, I felt, so as a child of abuse, being again in another abuse cycle,
you chose that. I'm saying, but what you have to remember is, this is not a blame. This is saying it is natural for you then not to have seen the warning signs when you went to make a relationship. But the question I want to ask you is, if your wife was treating you that way, possibly eventually with the children, they would see only you through her eyes. They wouldn't ever know you as the real person that you are. Is that true?
No, that's how I processed the breakdown of the relationship with my daughter, which was very strong for a long time. She was younger for a divorced situation. I stayed really close, paid a shitload of child support. Really, he's a very successful guy, right? So like I did my part and I did everything I could, but her view of me is so diminished as an adult.
Yeah.
And it's just it's impossible to build a good relationship with her now.
That is the tragedy of parental relationships, alienation, because what people don't realize is that drip, drip, drip of the dislike of the father and the fact that he's a failure and he's no good, that actually damages the early brain in childhood, doesn't it, Dr. T?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then, so in a sense, your daughter somebody would have to be able to explain to your daughter that she has to start all over again and begin to know you as you really are, not her mother's version.
And that would be well, and she may never be, but one of the things, but it's not hopeless. It took a long time before I could get there with my own father, who I was alienated from and blamed for everything. A really long time. But one of the things that may help you process it is to click and realize, oh, your daughter is a product of abuse. And
Absolutely.
You were the one doing it. Well, I mean, you
were.
No,
it's really interesting to bring that up because during this conversation, I had reflected on the problems my daughter would have with her mom as a teenager. She was a screamer. There was no hitting, right? But there was the screaming, there was the petulance, there was the, escalating to DEFCON 1 immediately, the pouting for 3 days, the shaming, the kind of irrational arguing and viciousness that an emotionally abusive person does. And I gave her coaching, like, how to deal with it that was empathetic in some ways, but I just had this question, like, why the fuck didn't I take her out of there?
Because the law wouldn't have allowed you to. How would you do it?
Well, I try, right?
They can't get full custody.
No, and that's indeed true. But I mean, just from a visceral nature, like if somebody fucked with my kid, I'd get them away from them. Period. Right? Like that's just no. And it just because it was coming from her, because of the way I saw it, it didn't occur to me to categorize it as dangerous abuse for her. It's really just it's kind of a really interesting thing for me to see here.
I have a double observation on that, and Dr. T and Erin can correct me if they think I'm wrong. I actually think you have two things going on there simultaneously. One thing that would be going on in your case would be you came up in an abusive environment, and therefore what is typical for those of us, I'm including me in this conversation, who grew up in a chaotic abusive environment, from childhood, we do not actually recognize abuse as abuse. Now, this is not to say that any time two kids got in a fist fight or any time a parent slapped a child in an intemperate moment, you grew up as an abusive childhood. But you and I know what real abuse looks like when you're a child, although sometimes we don't realize it until we're adults because we process this chaos, this insanity as normal.
Yeah.
Right, Erin? I mean,
I think that's absolutely true. And I think one of the problems for you particularly with your daughter is at some level too, and as a child I can say this, you're looking at both your parents and you're thinking, why was I born into this? They chose each other, but I was stuck with this. And from the child's point of view, you're actually right when you say I should have gone galloping in there and rescued her. So in the middle of all the damage and the fact that she grew up believing probably still to this day, you abandoned her, you betrayed her, you left her with her mother. That's going on as well, and that's part of the feeling of why she's cut you off.
And part of
How old is she now?
So she's 25, and can I just offer one other little factoid here, which I think will add to the conversation? This is, by the way, I've never had an opportunity to have this kind of conversation about this with people like you. So if you don't get it, this is incredibly, it's so valuable to have the chance to talk about this in this way. So my ex-wife basically had an affair and then married the guy she had the affair with and moved him and his dad, right? and shoot him up and spit him out. And you know, now that took longer because I swear to God, she admitted to me once she hung in the marriage 5 years longer than she wanted to, just so it wouldn't have to look like it was her that got divorced twice, right? You know, I'm not kidding. And this poor guy, you know, he was a good guy, and she wrecked him. And so from what I'm getting back to is my daughter's perspective on this is that the whole narrative of this is two men, me and the next guy, Tom, ruined her life. That's the narrative that she's given my daughter.
And she's trying to protect herself because to a certain extent, one of the hardest things for any child, boy or girl, is to admit that the mother, the woman that carried them and then cradled them or failed to cradle them, was in any way rejecting of them. Well, the most difficult thing, and that's why it's such a struggle for children when it's their mother who is the aggressor and the violent person, because to have to live with the fact that the woman you actually married and her mother probably loves no one, probably doesn't even know what love is. And so many women become deeply narcissistic women are incredibly damaged parents. And it takes a long, long time for the child, if ever, to recognize. In a man, it's far more obvious, and men are more obvious and physically explosive, whereas women run deep. And I think that your daughter is young still, 25 is still young, and maybe, I don't know if she has children of her own, but often that brings a change. Well, often that does bring a change.
The other observation, because I had the twofold outlook, one thing that happened with you scribblers, of course, okay, you can look back now and don't beat yourself up because you didn't know, because you grew up in a dysfunctional environment, and so you know, even recognizing that something was wrong was a problem for you, but B, and this will go back to the political, I suppose, we've also now had 30, 40 years of awareness of what abuse is, and we've been getting it wrong, and we don't tell men there's such a thing as an abusive woman. And your daughter doesn't even know there's such a thing, most likely. So it's two-pronged. I mean, when I hear that no one ever said it to you, you heard what Erin just said, too. It's so sad. Oh, my God, you're in your 50s and you're hearing this from two women for the first time almost.
I'm from you, Dean.
Well, surely. But I'm just saying, my God, we've got a lot to fight here.
I know.
Also, keep in mind, from a child's perspective, a child has no power. A child is completely dependent on mom and dad, or just mom or just dad, depending on the situation. And your daughter saw what happened between you and her mother. I mean, not all of it, but she knows mom got mad and you went away. Same thing with her stepfather. And you know, I think we don't give children enough credit, and I'm not saying this was conscious, but I'm sure she figured out if she wanted to stay on mom's good side and continue to receive mom's love, she needed to adopt certain attitudes, behave in certain ways. Parental alienation, I think the more insidious types are the ones where there are subtle cues, where mom said something, or dad, if he's the alienating parent, which prompts a child to say something denigrating about the target parent.
Well, you know,
it's a matter of psychological survival, I think, when you're with that type of a parent such as your ex-wife.
And to me, that's a horrible form of abuse in and of itself, though. It's a horrible form of abuse to the child in itself, and I identify that.
But the child the child is in an extremely maladaptive environment, and develops defenses that are also maladaptive but work in that situation. The problem, I think, happens when they continue those maladaptive defenses and behaviors and take them out into their adult relationships, because I guess it worked in a certain way. She survived childhood with mom to a certain degree. I mean, she got out, but I'm wondering how much of that is left over, that she's still just.
But that's why it's generational, isn't it? It goes from one gen, and you can trace. I mean, I used to do questionnaires in the refuge with the mothers coming in. You could trace it back generations, grandparents, great-grandparents, and down it comes. Oh, yeah. And the great hope that you have for your daughter.
Her mom was a drunken, raging woman.
Yeah.
Her mom's a drunken, raging, asshole, nasty, vicious, horrible woman.
Yeah,
Sorry, it's amazing.
And I know, and I can understand how you feel and the anger. But on the other hand, if you look at the other side, I don't know how much you knew about your ex-wife's family background. She's probably a product.
Oh, that's what I meant. My ex-wife's mom. My ex-wife's mom was the one I was talking about, not my ex-wife. My ex-wife's mom was a drunken, abusive, horrible woman.
Yeah, yeah. And
Isn't it amazing? You hear, the studies all show, but they can't apply to you, right? No, they do. They go right to your own life. I can tell you, Scribbler, that until I was in my 30s, I was still parroting my mother's nasty words about my father. And it didn't even occur to me until, even though I was already somewhat aware of domestic violence issues more than most people, it just hit me like a ton of bricks one day. I said something nasty about my father to somebody. He wasn't present.
Well,
and
so
it
I'll
just
give you
hit
one more
me like
angle.
a ton of bricks. It hit me like a ton of bricks that I had just repeated something my mother had said for years, and that it probably wasn't true.
There's another burden my daughter carries, and I know we're getting far afield, but I have to mention this, and I'm just realizing it as I listen to all this. So my ex-wife comes from this very abusive, messed up family system, right? By the way, hated her father just like my daughter's hating on me at exactly the same age. But my ex-wife and I were so committed at some level to not have that kind of abusive environment. I mean, we had radical abuse, right? Like alcoholism, abandonment, all kinds of horrible shit. I had a lot of physical violence. She had an absent, drunken mother, who's a floozy and just a horrible person. So, we had to have our daughter Alice be okay. See, I think she carries the burden of, and so she's high performing, right? Mm-hmm. She's beautiful. She's you know what I'm saying? She probably carries a lot of weight from both of us to be the proof that we've surmounted all that shit. That's another thing that comes from abuse, Anyway, Jesus Christ. It's a lot to get off my chest there, ladies.
I know.
When's the last time you talked to your daughter?
We haven't seen each other in a year due to this gaslighting incident that went on. And we've been corresponding over email. We were supposed to get together, and then she refused to do so again. We're estranged, essentially, now.
Okay. Have you ever just, since she's become an adult, just spoken the plain truth to her about what went on?
Between her mom and I? No. I never wanted to be that ex-husband.
Well, she's an adult now, and if she's ever going to start to deprogram herself and see with her own eyes instead of the warped lens her mother gave her, she's not a kid anymore, so it's not parental alienation. I'm not saying trash your ex, but if you have the opportunity to talk to her or are able to send her a letter, you might just want to say, look, I'm sorry about the animosity or whatever is going on, but here's something you need to know. And I understand that why you developed the beliefs you developed as a child, but here's what happened. And you're an adult now, and you need to think for yourself, and I love you, and I'm your father. I mean, put it in your own words, but I think at some point that the truth has to be told to these alienated children.
Yeah.
And too many counselors. Because I knew about alienation, and I did put an email. She rejects it all. I even tried to point out that when I pointed out that, when she was the same age, I met her mom when she was, her mom's age, at the same age, right? And her mom hated her dad at this age for no reason. It was only about 35 when she woke up to realize, because when I met the guy, I thought he was going to be like a monster, and he was the coolest guy on earth, and he'd been good to her his whole life. My daughter's uninterested in hearing all of that. But the one thing I think is really important that's come out here, I know there's other people listening that must be bored of me getting my personal therapy session here, but abuse is really a family systems issue,
Yeah.
It's not isolated to one person,
No.
It's really a mess.
No, in fact, Erin will tell you flat out, she'll just back me up, I know. When she was originally dealing, and all through her years of dealing with people fleeing abusive relationships, the ones who got out quickly and recovered quickly were the ones who didn't have abusive backgrounds in the first place.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they were quick to recover and quick to move on. Yep. And it was those who had the bad backgrounds that were still carrying this baggage
That's absolutely right. The folks I work with, the ones who come from abusive families of origin versus the ones who just were sold a bill of goods and thought they were being a nice guy, they tend to be stuck longer and have a harder time moving past it.
Unfortunately, if your daughter won't accept your emails at this time, well, you can't do much about that. Although one radical thought would be find some way to get this radio show to her. The archive is permanent. It's dangerous. But holy cow.
Oh, God, this is going to be leaked.
Oh,
my God.
Put the link in the card.
Not on here. Your real name's not here, but she'll know. And I'll tell you what, I guarantee something else, and then we'll let you go, Scribbler. I guarantee I'm going to give that advice to other men in your situation who are having trouble with their alienated kids. Send the archive to this show, which is going to be available permanently on Blog Talk Radio or on Live 65, and it will eventually be going up on YouTube. You're a dad in a situation like this, send this to your kids. Send this episode. If they can listen to the four of us talking like this, because you know what, Scribbler? There's a million guys in your situation. I know it for a fact.
That's it.
Yeah, at least. So I want to thank you so much for calling in. Ladies, what else should we talk about? We've got about 10, 15 minutes left before we need to wrap up the show. What else might we talk about here today?
I don't know. I was going to ask Dr. T, because it's such an intractable subject, Dr. T, one of the difficulties, and I would have probably said to Scribbler if we'd had more time, sometimes I have to say to somebody who's agonizing over their children in terms of parental alienation, you know, you've gone as far as you can to try and put all this stuff behind you as right, but at some point, if the damage that's being done to you as the innocent party is so great, you might have to put that burden down and just move on, because there is a big world of other relationships out there. And so many people can get stuck in the leaves of the dreadful, dramatic, horrific past that they've lived in, that they forget that they can move on, even with, although it's very painful for them. And almost in the moving on, very often in time, the children will change. But you cannot actually spend your whole life regretting what's happened in the past, because if you do that, you'll make that your future. Does that make sense?
I do, and I agree, and I don't do it often, but I have counseled some of the folks I work with to do just that, because particularly when the child is become an adult, you know, this is the thing that I wish family court would understand, that parental alienation doesn't stop when the child is 18. If done properly, it can last a lifetime, and which is why it's just so utterly corrosive and toxic. But no,
because one of the things that I've often said to men, look, you've got rid of your ex-wife, and you see her absolutely clearly and what she's been doing to you. Here you have the child, and it's like having your ex-wife again, because on behalf of the ex-wife, she's abusing just as much as the woman you left behind you.
Absolutely, and I have been working with men who still have minor children or adolescent children. That's one of the things that's really hard for them, because they're so desperate to see their kids. Kids are acting out, you know, they've essentially become little foot soldiers for mom, or they're sock puppets and are abusing dad, just like mom has done and continues to do through the kids. And I tell them, look, you need to set boundaries, and it might be that you don't see them as much, but if you continue to accept their abuse, that is going to continue, and you need to let them know.
Yeah, and you're never going to get a sense of self.
No, it's not okay for you to treat me like this. I am your father and your parent, and you must work that out as early as possible if you can. Otherwise, you know, they will your children will treat you however your ex-wife did, as an ATM, as a punching bag, as a source of ridicule, or somebody, you know, the person they hang all the blame for all the wrong, you know, everything that's not going as they would like it in their lives. And I think it's, you know, it's just it's taboo enough to end a relationship with one of your parents, but I think to say, okay, I'm going to drop the rope and walk away from my kids, at least until they're ready to reach out to me, is it's an incredibly horrible, painful thing to do, and but sometimes
sometimes it's necessary.
You have to do it, and you have to grieve that loss. It's almost like mourning that. It's like a death of a child. It is, right?
It is.
And
really
you have
is,
to go, find a therapist if you need to, who's skilled in grief counseling, join some grief support groups, but it really sometimes it's for your own, I think, for their own psychological survival.
And to save their own lives.
Yeah, you have to do it.
Hope seems to hurt too much sometimes. Yeah. And as hard as it might be, sometimes you have to emotionally divorce yourself from your children. Now, to me, that does not mean that you shut the door forever.
No.
But you stop waiting for the knock. You stop waiting for the email. You stop waiting for the phone call. And you move on. And you emotionally divorce them, and you wait for them. And if they never, you don't wait for them. The door is always there for them. And you know that, and you've done all you can. Yes, move on, make another life for yourself. Let go of the guilt,
find other positive relationships. If you have nephews and nieces, or friends with kids, or if you want to have children in your life, volunteer at an organization that hasn't completely demonized male volunteers to be around kids. But absolutely get on with your life, because it's so heartbreaking, but I think it is necessary in many cases. It's a tough subject.
It is a tough subject, but sometimes it just has to be done. Well, let's not just stop on a negative note. Let's end on a positive note. You can move on from an abusive relationship, even if the abuse has come from your children. And you can let go of the guilt, and you can let go of the pain, and you can stop beating yourself up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you have to stop beating yourself up if you want others to stop beating yourself up.
Upon you, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think you're absolutely right, Dr. G. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise,
and there's a lot more that we can talk about, so I hope you come back.
I would be happy to come back. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, and I'll leave with a couple of brief announcements. This show will also be being broadcast on live65.com. If you go to live65.com/A Voice for Men, you're going to find it there. It has been announced on the front page of A Voice for Men, but we are going to be migrating to doing most of our shows on Live 65 rather than Blog Talk. We're also going to be making a habit of archiving all of our shows onto YouTube, so you'll be able to get them there. What we want you to remember is that you are not alone. You're not crazy, or even if you are crazy, there's a way out of the crazy or to be less crazy. Guys, take care of yourselves and care about yourself.
Reach out for support.
That's right. It's available online, if nowhere else. Come to us. We're here at shrinkformen.com, avoiceformen.com, and we give a damn. And I think that'll do it for us this evening. Thank you very much, Dr. T. James, can you take us home, please?
Happy holidays, everyone.
You have been listening to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music is called Eternal Hope, and the closing piece is called Sunshine. Both pieces are by Kevin MacLeod and are used under the Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also wish to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and indeed all those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, in truth there is hope and healing, and we hope that you will be part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time in Revelations with Erin Pizzey.